The Aston Martin Valkyrie is a car that has struck a chord with many racing fans. Of course the car looks stunning, but there's no getting away from the fact that its engine is the car's main attraction and party piece. A glorious symphony of 6.5 litre naturally aspirated V12 Thunder. It's an engine type that many thought we'd never see the likes of again in a top echelon race car, but its return has been welcomed with open arms. V12 engines in general have always been given a lot of praise by the racing community, whether that be through other Aston Martin endurance races, F1 cars, BMW's V12 LMR, and so on and so forth. Yet there is another V12 engine vehicle that had a somewhat confusing life in the world of endurance racing. And indeed in the series formerly known as the American Le Mans series, its existence was welcomed, albeit somewhat puzzling. In the early noughties, Maserati was under the ownership of Ferrari, and with the intention of bringing Maserati back into the world of motorsport, the FIA GT Championship would be where a certain car would put that intention into fruition. Originally known as the MCC, but later officially called the MC12, this machine would be fairly significantly derived off of another Ferrari product in the Enzo. Not that you could perhaps tell from looking at it. It would end up using the same power plant as the Enzo, albeit with a few tweaks, and that power plant was a magnificent 6-litre V12 that put out 621 horsepower. A road-going version was made, which it had to be if the car was to be used in the FIA GT Championship. It would be a bit bigger though than the Enzo. In fact, this car in general was big. Certainly not tall, whilst it was taller than an Enzo, compared to some of the other GT1 cars it was competing against in the FIA GT series, it was a bit shorter than some of its rivals. However, its width and length were what made it so big. Perhaps the best way to kind of illustrate the Maserati MC12's size is through a comparison. A 4th generation Range Rover is, I'm sure you'll agree, a pretty long and wide car. In terms of width, with the mirrors folded in I might add, the Range Rover was 2073mm wide, whilst the MC12 was 2096mm wide. Whilst in terms of length, the Range Rover was 4999mm long, the MC12 was 5143mm long. And don't think this was to improve luggage capacity. Ultimately it didn't have any boot as such, but its size was done mostly in the pursuit of better aerodynamics. However, its size would create another hurdle. A hurdle that was related to the car's intention of going racing. Now, during the 2004 FIA GT season, the car was homologated by the FIA to compete for points. It had already participated in the races and was doing very well in them, but it couldn't score any points until its homologation was agreed upon. It would end up being very successful in the world of FIA GT racing, which was the intention of Maserati, as they wanted to demonstrate to the world again that they were a car brand with a rich racing heritage, and could be successful at it. But that was in the FIA GT series. However, in the world of Le Mans endurance races, the car was not compliant due to its size. The MC12 was racing as a GT1 car, but despite an update that made the car shorter, its width was still not acceptable for the ACO, and it was not eligible to compete in any of its championships, and thus ruling the car out of the Le Mans 24 Hours. Changing the width of the car was thought of being too expensive for Maserati, but it hadn't been ruled out at this point. However, they were allowed to participate in the 2005 American Le Mans series, except it was entered under certain parameters, if you will. For a start off, whilst the car would be recognised for any wins/podium finishes, it would not be scoring any points whatsoever. IMSA, the organisation that ran the ALMS, would also be able to, at its own discretion, regulate the performance of the MC12 GT1. It had a few ways it could manage this, whether that be through weight or rear wing adjustments, along with other methods. Then IMSA Chief Operating Officer Tim Mayer said, IMSA will be the final regulator of the performance of the car in the interests of ALMS competition, such that the race car operates within the accepted performance envelope of cars within the GT1 category. There were a lot of negotiations taking place as to how IMSA could bring the Maserati to the ALMS, but in a way that didn't make its competitors in the GT1 class too upset. And those negotiations were apparently very complex. But there's no denying the fact that one of the primary reasons that IMSA were prepared to find a way to bring the car over to the ALMS was because the fans were very excited about this car's existence. Scott Atherton, the ALMS CEO, said, "The inclusion of the Maserati in the ALMS will create great interest for our fans at the tracks and on TV. We expect our fans and event promoters will greatly benefit from the inclusion of this extremely exciting and competitive new ALMS race car entry. Claudio Berro of Maserati at the time said, "Pleased to have the opportunity to display our car in front of audiences in North America. This is one of the most important sales markets for Maserati, so this development is very important for our sales and marketing efforts as well. We greatly appreciate the compromise that has been reached, and looking forward to competing on the merits of our car, our team, and our drivers." But anyway, there was some racing to get on with, and Maserati's single MC12 entry would be operated by a regular Ferrari outfit, Risi Competizione, for the full ALMS season. I should also say that around this time Ferrari and Maserati were now more separate entities. What impact this had on the MC12's racing preparations? I don't know, but just I mention all the same. During the Sebring weekend though, David Richards from ProDrive, the team that operated the Aston Martin, wasn't very enthusiastic about how the MC12 was allowed to race, irrespective of whether it would score points or not. He said, "The situation is clear. It is not directed at any manufacturer. It is the protocol. It is the future of this class. It is clear that the Maserati is outside of the regulations, and as such, it should not be allowed to race." Meanwhile, for the first race at Sebring, their race was nothing spectacular. They qualify in 9th, with the caveat that qualifying was rained out and thus practice times were used instead, and would lose nearly 20 or so laps with a gearbox housing bracket that had become loose, and the team decided to do a thorough repair job. It was fairly quiet for them for the rest of the race, and finished 22 laps down behind the GT1 winner, and weren't really there on pace either, which to be honest, isn't all that surprising. The second ALMS round was at Road Atlanta. Not the Petit Le Mans, but a 2-hour and 45-minute affair. After qualifying well within a second of the Corvettes, which may have been to do with the weight penalty being decreased from 50 kg to 30, the truth was in the race, they weren't keeping up with the Corvettes. Third in the GT1 class for Andrea Bertolini and Fabrizio De Simone, a lap below the winner. For Mid-Ohio, the weight penalty was brought down to 10 kg, in line with what the car ran in the FIA GT series. The car was now less than half a second off in qualifying, yet the race would not go smoothly, with a few incidents bringing the Maserati's finishing position to 5th in class, 3 laps down. For Lime Rock, Fabio Babini replaced Fabrizio De Simone, but in practice, he'd end up putting an exceptionally rare supercar into some trees. Thankfully, the oil-induced off was at low speed, with minimal damage to the MC12. They qualified exactly 1 second off of the GT1 pole. A second podium finish was up for grabs, but a coolant leak delayed them during a pit stop, and would have to settle for 4th, 3 laps behind the GT1 winner. For Sonoma, the GT1 cars that weren't the factory-run Corvettes were given a few more performance tweaks. In the MC12's case, it was removing 10 more kilograms of weight, and increasing the diameter of a restrictor. However, whilst Maserati welcomed the technical update, the MC12 was not close to the factory Corvettes in qualifying, over a second off in fact. In the race, everything went by smoothly, but the raw pace just wasn't there, and they ended up 2 laps behind the winner. Mika Salo would replace Bertolini for Portland, but in the meantime, they qualified roughly 7/10 off of the Corvettes, and would be a few laps down on the Corvettes. They did apparently have a problem at some point during the race, although what the specific issue was, I don't know. At the amazing Road America circuit, the Maserati was just under 1.5 seconds off of the Corvettes. Again, it would be a clean race, this time with another class podium, but they'd finish 2 laps down on the winner. In Mosport, the GT1 field was very close to each other in qualifying, and the Maserati would end up less than half a second off of pole in 3rd. Ultimately though, whilst the MC12 was closer, it still couldn't quite keep up with the Corvettes or the privateer Celine S7R from Asemco Motorsports. For the Petit Le Mans and the finale at Laguna Seca, the Maserati's restrictor size would be reduced, and Fabio Babini would join them at Road Atlanta too. 6th in qualifying at the expanded GT1 field of the Petit Le Mans, just within a second of the pole time. In the race, a few punctures, a few spins, a vibration from the floor panel and general balance issues would leave the Maserati down 8 laps to the winner and 4th in class. However, the MC12 was noticeably off its competitors' average lap times throughout the race. The Astons, Corvettes and privateer Celine were in the mid to high 1-minute 20s, whilst the average for the Maserati was a 1:21.2. Not a million miles off, but every 10th can count. even in a roughly 9-hour endurance race. And finally, Laguna Seca, 6th again in qualifying, just under 2 seconds off of pole, but had a rather lively race. After getting stuck into the action, the MC12 would lead the GT1 class at around the halfway point, apparently assisted through pitting at the back of the queue during the cautions, getting their fuel effectively for free, but that didn't mean that the pack weren't on their tail. However, after a long pit stop and a 1-minute pit lane violation that would put the MC12 out of the battle, sadly the Maserati would suffer a retirement after contact would break a radiator. It was their first and only DNF of the season, but what can we draw from its first season? Well, simply put, it just didn't have the pace. Sometimes it was competitive over a single lap, but rarely had it on the long runs. If nothing else though, it was pretty reliable and gathered a lot of miles and data to build upon for the 2006 season, where it may have been allowed to score points. There were even rumours that a second MC12 would be run during some events of 2005, although that never came to fruition. Indeed, it seemed like, despite the controversy surrounding this amazing car, that 2005 was effectively a learning year for the car. After the round at Road America, Andrea Bertolini had this to say, which gave a bit of an insight into what the team were trying to achieve. Fabrizio and I used different tyre compounds for the development of the tyres, and now our team has more information about using the tyres in North America. It's good for next year, and it's a good baseline for us to start the test day at Mossport. So with that, it seemed like everything was geared up for a more competitive year for 2006, and the MC12 started out by not starting at all in the ALMS that season. I'd like to explain why, but I can't seem to find any information about why this was the case. All I can find is a small article which at the time said that it was just a rumour, but that is all. So all I can do is speculate, and give some of my thoughts as to why. Firstly, maybe after looking at the data, maybe the team thought that an MC12 just wouldn't end up being competitive in North America, and it wasn't worth the effort to compete in the ALMS. Maybe financially, it just didn't make sense to the company to do the program, and given the success the car was having back in Europe and more globally in general with the FIA GT Championship, they perhaps thought that continuing its presence in that was sufficient enough for them. Other than that though, who knows? But it is still a huge shame that we never got to see how this fantastic machine would have done with a year of development under its belt. But the MC12 story in the LMS doesn't end there. Midway through 2007, an LMP2 runner and a former regular in the US sports car racing scene, Freddie Lienhardt of Switzerland, would enter a couple of rounds in a GT1 Maserati for Duran Racing, alongside former kart racer and Spa 24-hour winner Didier Thys of Belgium. Freddie had bought the MC12 for his private car collection, but now decided to race it. Now the car was able to score points, although given how they were only competing in a few rounds it didn't really matter all that much. The first was at Road America, where they were second off in qualifying, and had a rather quiet race, finishing 3 laps down. They entered the Petit Le Mans 2 with Andrea Bertolini joining them, and remarkably, they got class pole by nearly a full second. However, it was a bit of a surprise, plus the Corvettes had run faster in practice. And indeed in the race, the Corvettes got round the MC12, and whilst one of them would DNF, promoting the Maserati to second, the car would suffer a water leak, losing 15 minutes, before having an accident at the last corner in the last hour, putting the car out. That would be the last time we'd see the MC12 in an ALMS race. However, despite the lack of success in the series, the Maseratis would be rather victorious in the world of FIA GT racing, winning 6 teams championships, 2 constructors titles, and 5 drivers titles, all of which happened between the years of 2005 and 2010. So the car had speed, without question, but for whatever reason, it just never worked out in the ALMS, which is a huge shame, I think. Because through this period, the GT1 class of the ALMS was starting to have fairly small entry lists, and it would have been nice to see the car stay in the series for longer than the season it entered, so that it could have given the Corvettes a consistent opponent to try and beat. And it seemed like Corvette 2 were really keen to have some competition. It might even have led the GT1 category to have lasted longer than it ended up doing, with any more prospective entries thinking that they could get in amongst the action. In the end, the MC12's ALMS adventure included a season that they were given no points for, with a few podium finishes, and a trip into some shrubbery, which in a car that is now worth many millions of currency is quite something, along with a few more races in privateer hands, and included a pole position. But still, that'll be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, then I'd be enormously appreciative if you did hit the like and subscribe buttons. Plus, what are your opinions on the MC12? Say down in the comment section below. However, until the next video, be kind to each other and enjoy the rest of your day.